let's talk about statues of famous racists. If you're outside of the United States, this may seem like a trivial story. Who cares if there is a statue of a problematic guy in the park somewhere? I've lived in cities where I've walked to work every day past statues and only thought to even look at the names on the plaques when friends visit from out of town and ask, who's that? I don't know, some guy who liked horses and tri-corner hats. But in the United States, thanks to our history of having half the country at one point agree that it's worth separating in order to secure their ability to hold other humans as slaves, things are a little bit tricky. Because after the slave-owning South was brutally put down like dogs in the Civil War, the United States decided to just let them off the hook. Like, prior to the Civil War, the only punishment for treason was death. But at the end of the Civil War, we looked around and we're just like, well, we can't just execute all of these idiots, right? So we changed the rules for the special little racists. And in the end, only actually one guy was executed for the most treasonous treason that has ever happened in the country. And unfortunately, that execution did not stop even the eventual formation of Mumford and Sons, much less the continued subjugation of Black people in the United States. That refusal to punish vile, treasonous, slave-owning racists led directly to the proliferation of a myth known as the lost cause of the Confederacy. The idea that the Civil War actually had nothing to do with slavery. In fact, it was a noble cause about freedom and chivalry and morality, and thus we should continue to honor the brave individuals who fought for these obviously good things. This is why in the years following the Civil War, people raised statues honoring Confederate heroes like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and George Pickett, and even just general tributes to the treasonous soldiers of the Confederacy. Americans also named streets and mountains and army bases after the slave owners, not just in the South, but in New York and Pennsylvania, in California, and even in the nation's capital. Up until now, historical research has shown that these statues, these commemorations, these memorials aren't just a sign of a continued belief in the lost cause of the Confederacy and a celebration of slavery-era South, but they create a feedback loop that strengthens that belief and makes life worse for the people that the Confederates hated, namely Black people. In Confederate monuments and the history of lynching in the American South, an empirical examination, researchers compared Confederate memorializations with the number of lynchings of Black people in those counties, finding the number of lynching victims in a county is a positive and significant predictor of the number of Confederate memorializations in that county, even after controlling for relevant covariates. And it's not just that these memorials were tied to racist violence at the time that they were constructed. In Monuments Outlive History, Confederate Monuments, The Legacy of Slavery, and Black-White Inequality, sociologist Heather O'Connell discovered that counties with Confederate monuments, specifically monuments inscribed with rhetoric glorifying either the soldiers as heroes or the cause as pure, have higher than expected levels of Black-white poverty inequality. Further, she found that the relationship is stronger where the legacy of slavery is weaker, namely in counties with smaller historical concentrations of slaves. So it's not just weird that the home of Disneyland, Anaheim, California, has a high school called Savannah High School with a mascot that is a Confederate soldier, but it's actually even worse than an identically racist school in like Alabama. These are just a few examples of why, in recent years, progressives have called for the removal and renaming of this anti-Black propaganda, and why our current white supremacist government is attempting to protect and reinstate it at a cost to taxpayers of tens of millions of dollars per monument. But a new study has just been published in Cambridge University Press suggesting that hey, have we considered that those monuments might actually be beneficial, perhaps? In Political Symbols and Social Order, Confederate Monuments and Performative Violence in the Post-Reconstruction U.S. South, Lee Orr and Corey Karlinski, a sixth-year PhD candidate in political science at Brown University, examined the effect of Confederate monument construction on lynchings and public executions in the postbellum U.S. South. Using a difference in differences design and original archival work, he finds that Confederate monuments reduced violence, acting as a substitute for performative violence in constructing a white supremacist social order. Effects are concentrated in counties where racial threat is higher. He then tests the effects of Confederate monument removals in the present-day U.S. and finds that removals increase the likelihood of anti-Black hate crimes. Okay, let me be fair, and Corey Karlinski is not necessarily arguing that his results suggest that we should leave monuments be or build more in order to placate racist white people, though that is a conclusion that many people will probably draw from the abstract. In the discussion, he suggests that a possible interpretation is that these statues represent an implicit threat to Black people, reminding them of the social order that places them at the bottom and thus forces them to flee the area or display subservience in order to survive, which I don't think Corey Karlinski is arguing is a good thing. His conclusion is merely that these statues, and he did only look at statues and not the naming of streets or other memorializations, and only at lynchings and not other forms of racist violence, gave racist white people the feeling of superiority they needed to placate them. And when those statues are removed and their superiority is lost, they commit violence in an attempt to reinstate the status quo as they preferred it. In other words, Corey Karlinski has data to suggest that a hit dog will, in fact, holler. Or perhaps more accurately, a spoiled dog will bite you when you try to take away its T-bone steak. The metaphor works, but I honestly feel really bad comparing a racist to a dog. But, you get my point. I just like dogs so much. Anyway, so my issue is not with Corey Karlinski's conclusions or even with the knowledge that this study will likely be used to support some racist idea that we shouldn't get rid of memorials to abject racists because that will just make the racists more violent. That's not my problem. My main problem is actually with how he leads up to this conclusion. And you may have already picked up on a bit of a red flag if you paid attention to what I said earlier about those earlier studies. Other researchers have already found a strong correlation between Confederate statues and lynchings. They have found that it is a positive correlation, not negative. Why is that? Well, for a start, Henderson et al., the authors of that first study I talked about, did not just look at Confederate monument dedications. They looked at monuments, the renaming of roads, the dedication of courthouses and schools and parks, the raising of flags, and more to create a more thorough picture of public-facing racist propaganda. Meanwhile, Corey Karlinski did even less than just looking at the number of monuments in a county. He only considered the initial dedication of a monument as though after the event, the dedication of the monument itself disappears the next day and there is no building up of the number of monuments over time. But even so, if you look at his chart, you can in fact see a very clear and obvious positive correlation between the number of monument dedications and the number of lynchings at certain periods of time. This is figure 2. You can see that up until 1905, lynchings were high but coming down while dedications remained somewhat steady. By 1906, there was a 20-year low number of lynchings. That's only, quote unquote, around 35 or so. But in the following years, there's a steep increase in the number of monuments built, with an equally drastic increase in the number of lynching victims, which continues until the peak of monument dedications around 1911. And then from 1920 to about 1925, there is a perfectly aligned spike in both dedications and lynchings. Like, what are we even doing here? If anything, this just seems like messy data. But for the sake of argument, let's pretend that there is a clear correlation between an increase in the number of monument dedications and the number of lynching and lynching victims. Does that mean that there is a connection, a causal connection? No. It could be pure chance, or it could be due to a third unknown cause that results in both. And thus, I present to you the boll weevil. That's right. Nobody expects the boll weevil. Back in 2020, economists at Boston University noticed something unusual. Between 1892 and 1922, a Mexican beetle moved into the American Southeast, obliterating cotton crops and eventually causing the equivalent of billions of dollars of damage. The economists conducted statistical analyses that found that Southern society became less violent and repressive in response to this shock, with fewer lynchings and less Confederate monument construction. Cross-sectional results leveraging spatial variation in the infestation and historical cotton specialization show that affected counties had less KKK activity, higher non-white voter registration, and were less likely to experience contentious politics in the form of protests during the 1960s. Now, it's worth noting that this does come from a working paper that has, to this point, never been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And considering that it was first drafted in 2020, I'm guessing it never will. So, is it scientifically supported data that shows that the humble boll weevil reduced violent racism in the South? No. However, I submit that this is still a very useful paper. To wit, you are at a party and you meet someone new. A blowhard, perhaps. At some point in the conversation, he suggests that maybe, hear him out. Maybe Pete Hegseth should spend $10 million to reinstall a racist statue to the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery. He's just playing devil's advocate, but, he's seen scientific data suggesting it's actually a good thing. You pause. You sip your drink. You look him in the eye, and you say, "But have you considered the boll weevil?" Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.